I'm here. I'm the CEO and founder of Lingua Franca, and I think it's great to do this with Chicago Wine Company. I have a long history with Chicago Wine Company. I used to buy wine from them when I was working in Chicago, and it was quite a lovely time to do that, especially in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, when the wine auctions and were plentiful, and wines were affordable for the most part. Even old Madeira would go for a few $100s at most if it were from the 18th century, and less than that for anything in the 19th, even early 19th. So things have changed quite a bit. And but the nice thing is that over time I was always a supporter. I'm from the Northwest. I'm from Seattle, and I was a wine buyer already in the professional wine buyer starting in 1981. And before that, I was a wine judge in the 70s, late 70s, for the Northwest Enological Society, and I was there when the first wines from Oregon came out. So I have a long history with Oregon, and I always have loved the wines of the Willamette Hills as the region developed, and there were more examples of wines in the area. There were more and more wines from the Willamette Hills. Christum was a good one. There were Bethel Heights. There was also wines from Seven Springs, starting with the 1985 vintage, and when I had the first wine that I tasted from Seven Springs, I thought, this is the best. I didn't know what it was. I never heard of it, so I tasted it and I go, this is the best wine I've had from Oregon, and it has more nuance, more finesse, more complexity, better acidity. It's integrated, and um, and then I tasted other samples over the years, and I thought, wow, I really, in blind tastings, I always prefer the wines from Willamette Hills, no matter where they are. They're usually not together. It's by alphabet or something, and you taste along, and all of a sudden you get a wine. This is a killer. Maybe I wouldn't have made it this way, but or whatever, maybe something else, but it has this layers of flavor. And so early on, I really realized that my favorite still was Seven Springs. And when I started a company here called Evening Land in 2006, actually, I started as an idea in 1996. I really liked the idea of getting something near Seven Springs because I thought Seven Springs would be too expensive. But there's a lot of land available, and we could get something very close on the same hill, maybe. And lo and behold, we started Seven Springs. It would be based on, we started Evening based on Seven Springs. We got a 35-year lease on it. And then when I was there, I looked across the road and there was this virgin land that had been a farm, but not really farmed. And I thought we should get that for Evening Land. And it looks like it's better. And we could plant it with the clones and the way we want from the beginning instead of inheriting stuff that's all a mishmash of different things. The company thought about it, and it took 2 years for me to negotiate the sale, to purchase the land. And then they never bought it. I left the company, and they decided not to buy it. So about 9 months later, I went back and figured I could you know, take all my savings and buy it. So I was very happy to do that and be the one to plant it and husband it. So with I think not very many of you have been to the Willamette Valley, and you may have heard something about the Willamette Valley, but I'm not sure if you understand the location exactly and what it means for viticulture. But because I've also had a 20-year, 25-year history of farming Cabernet in Napa Valley and making wine there and running two wineries, Inglenook, now one that's called Inglenook. It was Francis Coppola's Nippon Coppola estate, and then Quintessa. I have a good idea of what the differences are and how it affects the viticulture. So I'm gonna share my PowerPoint with you, and we're gonna go to that, and I will put up my slideshow. Here we go. There we go. So everybody should see that. I hope if you don't, raise your hand. And if any of you have questions, either Silas or Simon or somebody can read the question out, ask the question, and I'll be happy. That's more important than what I'm presenting, but you should at least have a great idea of what we're doing. And whoops, I'm not on there. Oh, you go. I'm going to go back here. So this whole thing is based on the land. So, and because of that, you have to be very careful. So we have a lot of nature. We have we have a great microbiome and a great biodiversity, including hawks that kill the rodents. They also this male hawk is one of five, maybe now six families that keep control of the rodents. And this one didn't like my position of the camera, and he kept attacking me because he had a fledgling, and he thought could be a threat, this big mammal. But they never dive bomb me, so I was okay, but they complained and flew overhead. So I decided to take a break from the landscape photo of the vineyard and take a few of the hawks. Anyway, we have a lot of biodiversity. Anyway, Willamette Valley is about it's exactly on the 45th parallel. Well, we're a little bit higher. We're a little bit higher than that. We're just a couple of tenths of a degree higher than 45, so pretty much right on the 45th, which is in the heart of the best zone for growing grapes in the north or the south hemisphere. And if you look at the across to the Atlantic, we skim the top of Saint Estèphe and we go over to where the very northern end of the Rhone Valley is actually. We're in the very northern end of Côte Rôtie, just south of Lyon. And then at 75 miles from us, if you were at the same location in France, we'd be 75 miles south of Mâcon and 125 miles south of Beaune. So when you talk about that, it's not much. If you look at where we are, this map is kind of hard to read, but we don't even make it up much past Portland on this map. We're, to that dotted line to Saint Estèphe, and it's just a little bit over to Beaune. So we're 125 miles south, which doesn't get us to it gets us to maybe to Centralia, Washington, not quite to Olympia, and so we have almost the same sunlight as they do in France. That's all it tells you. At the 45th parallel, that's the important thing, because you can go across the globe and you can be 10 miles from where we are, 10 miles or 20 miles east, and it'll be a totally different climate. 20 miles east, you'll be on top of a mountain, and 35 miles east of us or 40 miles east of us, you'll be in a desert plateau. So it's the difference in climate here can be enormous on the same parallel, but the light is the same, the daylight hours, and the angle the light comes to the earth. So when you look at that, in the Midwest, you'd be in Menominee, Wisconsin, or St. John, New Brunswick, if you're on the East Coast. So that's north for North America, but it still only gets you to where Burgundy is. And we have longer daylight hours, moderate to warm temperatures in Oregon. They're the same actually over a 100-year period, almost identical to Beaune Meteorological Station. They have a little weather monitoring thing. So our temperatures are almost the same. And, some years they'll be hotter. They've been much hotter than we've ever been in the last few years. But overall, we tend to be a little bit warmer in July and August. And then we can be colder. Where we are, especially in the Willamette Hills, is the coldest part because we have these winds, which we'll talk about, that influences our climate. The nice thing is we have usually not cloudy, rainy days in summer the way they do in Beaune, because they have more rainfall in summer in Burgundy than they do in winter. Winters can be cold, but gray and not wet. Our winters are extremely wet. So we're about 30 inches now here for the January and February, and we'll get more as we go on. So if you look at that, this is where we are, the Willamette Hills, just north of Salem. So Salem is about, 50 miles south of Portland. So we're just north of Salem. And then, and in the Willamette Hills, we're in the northern part of the Willamette Hills in the first Eola Hill, and we're the closest to the river, which means we also have winds coming down valley. They come across the gap here. You can see my cursor. There's a gap here from Amity to the road that comes to us called the Lafayette, Hopewell Road. Our address is Hopewell, so it's the Lafayette Hopewell Road, and there's a gap here from Amity to then, and then river, it narrows. The river comes closest to us, so we have a kind of a funneling of winds this way, and then it spreads out. So it tends to be really windy where we are. And in addition, the Eola Hills, all the soils that are really great in Oregon, I think, and don't tell some of my friends elsewhere, but in Dundee and here, we're predominantly volcanic soils based on a 15 million year old basalt flow that started about 450 miles to the east of us. And one of the fissures that caused this flow is near Ritzville, Washington. So you can look that up. It's near Spokane. So that's a long ways, way on the east side of the state on the border with Idaho and Washington. It came and it formed what's now the Columbia River Basin. And it did that because it was so heavy, it sank the crust of the earth. It's 3 miles thick near the beginning of the flow, near the Idaho border, with the 1 mile sticking above ground and 2 miles sunk into the crust. And when you get here, it's only 150 feet thick. And that's what got uplifted into these hills that you see in my picture behind me. Those hills were lifted up over the last 15 million years. And so it's a heavy basalt layer that got cracked into having fractures, and that fractures holds the water in winter for summer. And the vines, even after they're planted after 1 year, they get that water from those cracks in the rock. This rock that you see here is one of like 5 piles of rocks that we pulled out of the north part of the vineyard just to plant the grapes, because you couldn't plant grapes. You had to pull out all these rocks that came off the bedrock. You can see it at the bottom of the photo there. And then to give you an idea of why we have this cooler area, this is an aerial map or an aerial, satellite photo of the region. Here's our vineyard on the east side of the hill, of the Amity Hill here, the first Amity Hill, and it faces east. So we get the morning sun. It's elevated, and it has tilt, so it has really great exposure to the sunlight. Starting at about 4:30 in the morning, you start to see some sunlight come over, and then at night it goes till like 9:45 or 10 even. But direct sunlight for photosynthesis here would probably be between 4:30, 4:45 if you want synthesis in the midsummer, and then probably till 9:30, because the sun is already so far over, we have a shadow, but there's still reflected light, but it goes down to 10:15 or something with twilight. So we have long days, but this wind is constantly coming off the ocean. You can see a little peak of the ocean, and it comes directly over us. So you can see that coming right there, and that cools us off. So we have natural air conditioning all summer. That's why we're cooler than other parts of Oregon. And as you know, Pinot Noir likes to be cool. And the one thing you have to remember is there are 2 cycles in grape growing that are very important. One is the ultraviolet. That's the length of the day and the quality of the sunlight that you get. So our days are longer than Napa, and they're also cooler because we have all these cooling effects off the ocean. And because of that, we can have low alcohol. Sugar accumulation is based on heat. So we have lower heat, and we have longer sunlight hours. So we have more photosynthesis, more evolution of polyphenols, of tannins and flavor compounds in the grape. And this is, if you look at the map, this to the left is west, to the right is east. And the elevations are here. So it starts at 250 feet above sea level, then it goes to, on the lower hill, it goes to 320 on the right side. And then there's a little part of the vineyard that faces west, so it gets only the afternoon sun, but it's between 250 and 350, and then it goes up to 520. So there's a little bit of elevation gain. As you can see, it's pretty steep in here. This central part right above this was carved out by a spring. This is a natural spring that flows off of starts in our property and flows to the neighboring property, where it's captured in an old reservoir called Schindler's Reservoir. Nothing to do with Schindler's List. It's just Schindler was the owner of that property some time ago. Anyway, that's the layout. And this is the soil. If you superimpose the soils, all these are volcanic except for the Witham silt, which is, can hardly see it, but there's a dark area here coming down, and Wilton silt is kind of over the bottom part of that little L-shaped upside down L, and that's another spring that feeds into this major spring flowing off. And because of that, this is the main spring. Here's another spring coming down, and it carries with it silt from here, and this is carrying with it silt from down around here. And this area is what's called a colluvium in place silt. Down at the bottom, which depends on where your gallery photos of us are, at the bottom is the woodburn soil. That's the only part of our vineyard that has any Missoula flood soils. So I talked about all these volcanics being formed 15 million years ago. This was formed 12 to 15,000 years ago by the floods that at the end of the glacial period. And it carried soil. It's called the Missoula Floods because it carried soil along the Columbia River basin, which had formed over the basalt flows all the way down to past Eugene, Oregon. And so you see the Willamette Valley in the lower elevations has these flood soils. And at the bottom of our vineyard, some washed up. And that's right here. And that's where we get our Avni Pinot Noir from, basically. It's heavier soil, it makes fruitier wine. Heavier soils make fruitier wine. At the top, they're only 2 to 4 feet deep, 2 to 5 feet deep on top, and the Gelder Majori and Nikaya complex only goes to 4 feet. And only at the edge here next to Seven Springs, this is Seven Springs right next to us on the top of the hill here. Uh, it's Jory, so it's a little deeper. But these are our most complex soils and provide the most flavor. And you'll see that in some of the wines that we make. If we had plow today, it would be there. And this is how I divided the vineyard. So that's pretty much it. Any questions on that? Anything you wanted to know about Oregon or what we're doing right here in the Yosemite Hills? Any of you? Because I think it's interesting how different it is. It's not marine sediments like you'd see in Burgundy, but it's volcanics that provide the same kind of soil structure for water that the marine sediments do for Burgundy. So here, before I leave this aerial photo of the vineyard, this is the first hill on the east side. From the gate to the vineyard to the stand of cedar trees here, there is there is a very shallow band of soil called Nikaya. And along that band, I planted our Chardonnay. So basically from here to the gate, along a few rows alongside, maybe 15, 20 rows on one side and 10 or 15 on the other, there is a plant. All the Chardonnay we had originally was there. And it makes really great wine. We'll taste, that'll be the first wine we taste, as a matter of fact.
Larry, which way are we facing on that photograph?
We're facing due west. So the hill is the top of the hill on the west side, and down here at the bottom where we are is the east side. And the winery would be behind us and farther to the east. It's on the same property, but it's a little bit farther to the east. So should we, why don't you get your glasses? Do you want to get your glasses out and we can start tasting the estate Chardonnay, I guess?
Before we move on, we did have two questions. One is from Richard Shepro. Do you do any mixed plantings? The other is, are all your wines from grapes on this plot?
Okay, most of our wines, all our Pinot basically comes from here, except one that we'll taste today, Mimi's Mind. All the Pinot comes from our own estate now. We didn't plant much Chardonnay. Altogether, we had 7.5 or close to 8 acres of Chardonnay, but the amount that we sell and produce for, is not really sufficient from our own estate. We do make the estate wine from the estate, and sometimes we have a little bit that goes into the Omni wines, but the Omni wines are primarily from purchased fruit. So, because we just don't have enough Chardonnay. And I didn't expect when I planted the vineyard that we'd have much success with Chardonnay because it's so hard to sell. It's still an unknown item for most people. And I think some of you out there listening probably never have had a great, or haven't had exposure to a great Oregon Chardonnay before, because they haven't really been out only since Dominique really has been active and has influenced Oregon. When we began with Evening Land, we were ridiculed. He was ridiculed for picking a month too early his Chardonnay. And he said, well, we'll see. I want to pick it this way. I think it's ready. We don't make much and I want to do it this way. And it was a big hit. But even so, he was there for 7 years. And even when we began here, the first 2 years we started Lingua Franca, we were still ridiculed by our neighbors for picking too early everything. And then they started tasting our wines, and people started being more receptive to a Burgundy kind of a flavor profile and structure, European structure with acid and bounce and a lack of oakiness. And all of a sudden, these were the things that we wanted. So we have to thank Dominique. Oregon has to thank Dominique for his contribution to the way this whole place has evolved, especially for the Chardonnay, interest in Chardonnay. And the way more and more people are doing what he has shown them how to do here, has shown the way to do. So Dominique obviously is an important part of our project. He's a partner with us, and he has been a major contributor a mentor to Thomas Savre, who is our winemaker and worked at Domaine du Jacques and also at Domaine de la Romanée Conti. So here he is. He's young. He's like 34 now, 33 maybe, but he started being 28 or 29 with us. And he was full of ideas, and he's gotten better and better with time. And as he's come to understand the area more and more. And fortunate thing is he's married a woman from Arkansas, and so far he has a permanent resident status. And so we hope to have him for a long time. And this is us in the vineyard a couple of years ago, pre-COVID. And we seem to be happy with the wines we just tasted that we made from the previous vintage. In fact, some of them may be the wines you're tasting today. And this is how it looked, how it looks normally in winter. And this was 2014 when we were just finishing the first year after it was planted for a year. These are some of the rocks you can see. The rocks in front are the size of VW bugs. They're pretty big rocks, and they took quite large machines to remove. So this is how
we did have another question, and it's probably it might be more appropriate to bring it up in when we talk about Mimi's vine. But Alex asks, I've noticed a shift towards regenerative farming in the Napa region. Are you seeing the same shift in Oregon? If so, are regenerative methods similar?
Oh, well, regenerative is, it's not defined yet as a specific school, but we have been very forefront of regenerative farming. We took Mimi Castile, who's one of the main proponents of regenerative farming in Oregon, and we hired her right away as soon as we could, because she wasn't available the first year we were farming, but she became available as we were establishing the vineyard and starting to make wine in 16 and 17, when she finally could join us, having left her family firm temporarily. When she rejoined her family firm, when they resolved their differences, she no longer had worked with us, but she's an inspiration. And so if you see this page, we do use, if you can see in the top, it says regenerative farming philosophy. And that's something that we've learned to do with her, and also my winemaker wants to do. And Dominique has been wedded to BD and Burgundy, and we hope to be able to convert everything to biodynamic here. But unfortunately, biodynamic practices sometimes are really tough for us, just because of the amount of mildew pressure we have in spring. As I said, it's wet here in winter, but it can be wet all the way into June and through June sometimes. So the amount of waste we have for just, putting sprays in the vineyard with the tractor going back and forth and burning gasoline is more wasteful than trying to use something like a cinnamon spray, which is okay for organic farming. I think it's now recently been approved for BD, but not when we started. And then other things that we do that may be less in line with organic or biodynamic, but are better for the environment overall, considering the other alternatives are more wasteful. And that's what Mimi Castile, recommends, in her farming, is that do the least harm, do the most good. But, sometimes there's a trade-off between something that's bad and something that's worse. And so you try to do the best you can with, and she's experimenting, and we have too, with no-till farming and everything. But some things work and some don't. We can't do no-till farming. We do like rotational low-till farming now, because we wound up with we lost crops because of it. I mean, lost a lot of entire crops sometimes. So not a good thing to have if you also have to stay in business. And then, here's Dominique again. So this all our protocols are the same. I can talk about these as we taste the state Chardonnay, but basically there's low oak flavor and everything. It's easy to remember our protocols. We use 20% new oak on everything, pretty much. There's only one or two exceptions since we begun, and we also only use large format new oak. The volume by 20% for the whites is large format. It has to at least be 600 liters, 600 liters now. And we also have a 3,500 liter cask that the whites go into. So the bigger the container, the less the contact with the exterior, or with the oak in this case. And all our oak is proprietary low toast. It's called a long and light. It's a long and slow toast for the barrels. So minimum amount of caramelization of the wood. And so it doesn't have that smoky or burnt or toasty flavor in the wine at all. We just want to get the wine in the wood so it can breathe. So we don't have to pump it over. We don't want to manipulate the wine as much as we can. We just want to let it do its thing. And if you put it in wood to ferment, you don't have to do pump overs. The wood breathes. Why? Because there's a bung and it can breathe. The bung has to be loose during fermentation, so it breathes through that. It breathes through the staves, and you get all sorts of on-demand oxygenation of the must as it's needed by the yeast, instead of having to guess how much it needs now in the morning once and in the evening again when you pump over. So, and it's all wild yeast. It's We do everything he does in Burgundy, basically. We use even sometimes the exact same press protocols he uses, that Dominique uses in Burgundy. He gives them, we have the same press, the same Euro press that he has, and we just take the programs and we alter them, and Thomas alters them as he thinks he needs to for our particular harvest conditions. And the reds are also wild yeast fermented, but they're in tanks. And instead of doing pump over, we do pump overs there. But then as it gets to the end of fermentation, we start not to do pump overs and we do punch down. So we don't have to oxygenate the must as much. But we're very judicious in punch downs, which are done by barefoot. They're the traditional foot stomping punch downs in our tanks. But we only try to do 2 or 3 per harvest per tank, just so we don't over extract, because the pump overs already extract enough usually, or close to enough. And then you taste and you decide, okay, we can go a little farther, but not too much. And everything else, whites are not fined or filtered. Well, they're fined, but whites are fined and filtered. Sorry, whites are fined and filtered with milk protein, casein, and the reds are not fined, but they may be lightly polished filtered. They're not really a filtration. It's more like it's a strainer that catches larger particles so that the bottler won't sue us for damaging his equipment. They pretty much demand that kind of thing. So that's it. Any questions on the ferments? Any, wild yeast, natural acid? We don't add acid to the whites at all. It's totally what it is. And the flavors that you taste, if you're starting to taste the Chardonnay, which I invite you to do, because of my situation here, I didn't get here in time to find the state Chardonnay. I have an empty bottle here, but I drank that last week. So. But I do have this frequently. It's a if you had other Chardonnays next to it, like you'll have the sisters later, this has a richness to it that you don't find in some of our other wines. Oddly enough, it has great acidity, has better acidity than some of our other wines, but it has a richer mouthfeel. And part of that is the contribution of our clones. Like this clone is 76, so you can see there's a lot of fruit hanging on this. But so this is 76. So good clusters, good fruit. You can see it's like this was picked. This is the way we like it. Slightly golden on the outside, but green, still has greenness to it, because when we taste it, it has fully developed flavors. It doesn't need to be golden. It doesn't need to be 15% potential alcohol and raisining already. We like intact fruit with fresh acidity. And the flavors are coming from the place, from the ground, from the environment, the microbiome in the soil, and from the fermentation, the yeast, the wild yeast fermentation in barrels that are naturally regulated. So that's where you get that, the natural acids there. But another clone that we have is called 548. And 548 has low yields. It's grown next door, basically, on the same strip of land as we grow the 76, but it naturally it has lower yields, it has looser clusters and smaller berries, and it also has a richer mouthfeel. In fact, I planted it because my vineyard man, who was the preeminent nursery specialist for Burgundy, his name is Jean-Marie Guillaume. He has a company called Pépinière Guillaume, and Guillaume is, Pépinière means nursery, Guillaume Nurseries, and he provides material for DRC, for Griveau, for Lafont, for everybody. And he does a lot of Massal selection. So that's what I did. I did a Massal selection from specific vineyards. And then I took his advice on the 548, which he said he has some from ENTA Vinra, which is the official French government authority. So it's a clone, a specific clone from them. And he said, when I have to replant a vineyard in Le Montrachet in Burgundy, and the owner doesn't have any material he wants to plant of his own because his grandfather or father didn't only produce, large scale producing clones, not the high quality, low yield clones, I recommend 548. So I go, well, what the heck? The only other thing I have that I really want is 76, and I need some diversity. So I planted that. And in a way, that answers the person's question: do I have any interplanted vineyards where I have, blocks in my vineyard where I have different clones coexisting? And no one here would do it for me. I tried, but the vineyard, I didn't plant it. I had to have a contract, was the best I could get in Oregon, but they, as many in California would refuse to do, is plant a different number of clones or types next to each other in the same vineyard. They say, oh, they'll all ripen at a different rate, which isn't true. Actually, they have kind of hormonal regulation. They communicate. We know the plants communicate by hormones and by enzymes through the soil, and they regulate themselves together. And so you don't have that problem. They try to ripen together. So it wouldn't have been an issue in there. And we actually do get fruit for Avni and sometimes for some other clump, maybe for sisters. Not in this case, also for sisters, you'll taste that in sisters, where the person who planted it was able to get it through. It was a few years later, and he was able to get that idea through to the same people, results partners, to plant it that way. So here it is. I said we plant about 50, it's about 50-50, 548 and 76, but actually that shows you the difference in yield. So it comes out 50-50 in terms of acreage, 60-40 in terms of the yield. And that's why it's 60-40. We used entirely what we could from both sides, and they were both equally good, but that's what you get.
Larry, before we go on, do you mind just explaining to people exactly what selection maisal is? And we also had a question from Lydia about the foot stomping, about that pigeage. She asks, is the foot thing clean? How about
Yes.
athlete's foot?
No, it's clean. It's clean. We make them wash off their feet. If anybody has any foot problem, they're not going to be doing this anyway. We'd find out. But basically, it's a sterile environment. If you saw what goes into a tank when you crush fruit, when you're making wine, there's what they call MOG, material other than grapes, and it's insects and things like that. And we're meticulous in cleaning it out. We do a specific sorting. We even have a vibrating table that knocks the insects. They jump off the fruit. But when you pick something like that, there'll be wasps, so we get stung because they jump off. Earwigs, ladybugs, stink bugs. I don't want any of those in my wine, but many wineries don't have that kind of a table because it costs money. It costs a lot of money, and it's a nuisance to run because it slows you down. But we do that because I don't want the taste of ladybugs or stink bugs or earwigs or anything in my wine but the grapes. So we're very meticulous. But I can honestly say not every winery is, but you're not going to get sick from it because it ferments for quite a while, and you have alcohol in there, and then it's aged for another year and a half or two in that alcohol, and by that time anything is dead. That isn't a wine bacteria, for example. That wine bacteria can live in wine, but other stuff won't. So it's not going to affect you. So you can rest assured it's clean. And ours especially is pretty meticulously clean.
She said thank you.
Yeah, and frankly, I now stomp on it with rubber boots because I cut. It's just too painful. It's when you have a tank full of fruit that is whole cluster, and the clusters are up there with the stem sticking out, and you try to stomp on it, it's painful. Now, if it's destemmed, it's a different matter. You can kind of get in there, swish it around if you can. But frankly, if I stand on the tank, whether it's stemmed, destemmed, or whole cluster, I just walk across it. I don't have much of an effect. I'd be a useless plongeur. I would be a useless pigeageur to get any effect because I wouldn't be so delicate. The grapes wouldn't know anything was happening to them. The idea is to sink the caps back into the wine so it kills the vinegar bacteria. That's what you're really trying to do that's one of the effects of either pump overs or punch downs. Punch downs are done often with a mechanical tool or a device, but we do pigeage, which means really literally with the foot, walking with the foot. And it's more gentle with the foot because you can feel it. You feel what you're doing more, and you can be gentle or harder, based on what you're told to do, what you feel the wine needs. And that we like the hand touch. In fact, most of the great wineries in California too, and in Oregon, they're doing pigeage because it's better if they have the time and they have the manpower to do it. Any other questions? There was maisal. I didn't talk about maisal. Maisal is basically taking a sample of a specific vine and propagating it for the material, the genetic material that's on that particular vine, as opposed to a clone. The clone is one specific genetic material that is being propagated. Often it's done in a lab these days because in an attempt to be ahead of a virus, of plant virus that would kill it or affect the lifespan of the plant. And in fact, in California, it's mandated they must do what's called micro tip shoot propagation, which means they take a cell as it emerges in a petri dish, and then they propagate that single cell that's clean into whole plants over a number of years to arrive at a whole plant that they can then propagate that is totally virus free. Because as you know, viruses are contagious, and often these plant viruses, you take a cutting from a plant and you think the plant's okay, but then you propagate it, and then all of a sudden every vine in your vineyard is infected by some disease that will kill it. It won't hurt you. It'll just kill the vine ultimately and shorten its lifespan and affect the quality of the flavors. So masalas, if you have a vineyard with a lot of different material that you've inherited because you've had a vineyard that's been there for 100 years or 60 years, in France, for example, or then you propagate the vines you like the best, and you can say, I'm going to make, and you'll interplant them with other vines that you like, so you have a little diversity, but you choose the vines, and then the nursery will propagate them for you. In America, that's impossible. The only person who would do it for me in America is Guillaume. Guillaume was used to the practice in Burgundy, and I could bring material to him that he would plant, and including material from Ponzi family heritage block that they brought here in 65 or 66. And I like their Pommard clone the best. And so my Pommard clone is from Ponzi family heritage block. They sold it to me, and it makes some of the best Pommard clone wine we have. So this is the vineyard in Spring with a view of Mount Hood. That's where the Chardonnay is. And this is again, so that it's along that ridge here, right here, and looking to the east to the mountain. We see 5 volcanoes from, it depends where you are on a clear day, and if there's no haze, you can see Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood, Mount Jefferson, and also Sisters. But here's Sisters. But Sisters is not about the volcano. It's about my mother and her sister. So it's the Sisters. We wanted to call it Two Sisters, but someone had that name, and we were thinking of other names, but we had to come back to Sisters because it was inspired by my mother's and her sister's love of each other, and they grew up in a vineyard and farm in Romania, and my grandfather there made wine, as well as growing wheat and being the town miller and having cattle. So they were farmers in Romania, but they made wine for the village, and it's the only thing they got back of the farm after the war was the vineyard. But then they got out of Romania. Those who were stuck behind, they got out of Romania when they could. So, but anyway, it honors my mother and her sister who stayed together all 90 years of their lives, and were separated only for about 6 months after the war, and that was it. So anyway, it's the top. This is not from a particular vineyard, but it's the top barrels that we have, the top lots of wine that we've made all year in Chardonnay. And we looked to, they're all from the same kind of macro climate. They're all from very similar soils that are either Nicaea or Gelderman, or Witzel. They're really shallow. The shallowest Witzel soils, they're shallower than Nicaea. Nicaea is 2 to 4 feet deep of, you have 2 to 4 feet of topsoil, and then you have bedrock. And with Witzel, it's 0 to 2. So you can imagine it's almost impossible to plant on 0 topsoil. But Witzel soils and Nicaea soils are found in the same kind of hill because they're eroded. So Witzel is more eroded than Nicaea. And that's what we look for great Chardonnay, because it has the most mineral quality. So if you taste this, there's kind of you're having the 17, I believe, not the 18. Is that correct?
17 Sisters.
Yeah. It'd be nice if you had the 15 or 16, because these wines mature beautifully and they develop almost a white truffle aroma, very light white smoke, white truffle aroma, like struck gunflint kind of white smoke and truffle. And I had it with a truffle dinner, and it was on a fluke dish, and it was amazing. It was just, if we had the wine before the dish came, and people thought, oh, do we smell the truffle yet? And I'm putting my nose in the glass, and I go like, no, it's the wine. I'm going like, I never had that smell from it before, but it smelled like white truffles. And when the white truffles came, they weren't quite as ethereal and as sublime as the white truffles sent from the wine glass. So people were like doing and awing, and we had about 3 3-star chefs and a couple of 2-star chefs preparing this very luxurious gala dinner. And they all, what wine did they want? There was Batard Montrachet, there was Corton Charlemagne available, and they all asked me for every drop I had of the sister Chardonnay, and wanted to know where they could get it in France and in Canada, and in and then and Chicago and L.A. where the other chefs and some of the other chefs were from. So it was a hit. Anyway, this is mainly 76, but it has some. It has a contribution in 17 vintage from a vineyard that has a mixed planting of about a dozen different types of Chardonnay within a small block, and it's very close to us. So it's, again, it's like within the old Amity Hills. Even though we put Willamette Valley there because we just don't know when sisters will come from a different place. The first year it was from 3 different AVAs, predominantly from another vineyard that we now manage in our state vineyard called Bunker Hill. And the other two, that was in no area, because Bunker Hill is in Salem. It's applying for an AVA called the South Salem Hills. It's not up yet. And then the other one came from Yamhill Carlton, but again, it was Nicaea soil in Yamhill Carlton. And the other one was in Dundee Hills, but again, it was Nicaea. So we just like Nicaea or Witzel. And
so Larry, you said that this is a blend of barrels, so not just plots, but the barrels themselves. So you're going through tasting and picking out the best samples from each of the barrels.
Yeah, we do extensive tasting of each barrel lot by lot, a couple of hundred every vintage to go through, and we make notes of what we think are A or B or C, and we want anything below C, we're not even going to consider for anything, but we usually take A and B for our wines, and maybe some of the C's will go into Obni wines. But sometimes we don't really have anything that's a C. Almost everything is an A. It depends on the vintage. But we do make a rigorous selection, and anything that would be D, we'd only keep it if in case we thought it could be graduated, maybe higher, maybe it just needs time and it could be a B wine. And anything that's an E, you get rid of, either dump or sell if it, some people will buy it. And then even our E wines are probably better than many other people's wines that they're putting in bottle. But A wine, and in the A wines, when we go through, there may be, I don't know, a half a dozen white barrels or white lots of different wine that we go through that we think are really good. And then we go, okay, these two are the best of those best. And then we go like, well, do they fit together? Maybe not. Maybe one of these should go into something else. We have another blend called Shares of Me, sold only at the winery. It's a really top wine, but it doesn't make sisters. We'll put it into that. And then maybe this other wine that wasn't so good, we try it out in the blend and we go like, oh, that makes the blend really perfect, because it provided something that on its own wasn't that interesting, but with the blend. So we do a lot of experimentation. It's something they couldn't do in Burgundy. In Burgundy, you've got the vineyard, that's it. But when we started, we had no estate fruit the first year. So already it was fun for Dominique to experiment with blending, and the idea that he could, if he had a wine, he could improve it if he had something else. But given that, all these soils and all these wines that we buy and make, I mean, we make the wine, but all the fruit that we buy comes from a soil that is very similar to what we have here. And most of it is from neighbors. Frankly, in this wine, nothing came from farther than a mile and a half away, I think. Maybe a mile and 3/4 most for one of the parts of the vineyard. Came from two growers next to us, basically on the other side of Seven Springs. And then the following vintage, we had it mainly from one of the vineyards that we had it from in 17, but some of it came from a new source that we never bought from before or since. We didn't like the fruit afterwards, and we didn't like the fruit before, but we bought it that year because it seemed really interesting, and we thought it could go into our Avni blend, but instead it went into our sisters. Who would have thought? I mean, I was surprised. But again, it was the owners of that vineyard say it had some limestone. I don't know. I haven't seen any limestone here, but they said it did. It was good anyway. It doesn't matter. It wasn't good the next year at all. We didn't buy any. So usually we have the same sources, but that was a flyer. We thought we'd try it because it seemed so interesting, and they're nice people. So Any questions on sisters? So it changes from year to year. It's just the best that we can produce, and it's usually best, however you define that, based on longevity, complexity, and also finesse. So it's our most finesse wine, the wine that will age the longest and develop the most finesse of any wine, and will have a wonderful evolutionary curve. And we know that it's possible because the first wine that Dominique and I made together in the Willamette Valley was the 2007 vintage of Seven Springs. We made a wine called Sumum that year, and I'm enjoying that wine now. It's just finally coming around to being perfectly mature. It's not old. It's gotten to a point where it's really wonderful, and it'll probably hold that for another 10 years. No sign of falling off. Frankly, it probably ages better than some white Burgundies at this point. That's a sad thing because white Burgundies, as you know, those of you who are fans of white Burgundy, it's not always had the best history, but I think they've straightened up. On the whole, I think almost everybody's straightened it up now. I haven't really seen much sign of premature aging, but some vintages, you go, I don't know, they're too young to tell, but some vintages you wonder. There's possible we have vintages, our 17s, I think, are probably our most forward wines, but I think they still will age. 16s and 18s are really tight, so they'll last a long time.
It's a beautiful wine, I have to say.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's probably not right for me to venture into what's happening in Burgundy, but everyone knows about it. It's sad because I've had wines that I bought and I believed in, and they didn't age. And when I started buying wine, I could buy wines from the 60s, and that's because people kept wines a long time, and those wines were good in the 80s and 90s, and even up until the early 2000s. And I didn't have any more to taste. But I had a 64 Ampo, I think, in 2003 or something, and it was incredible. And I wish I'd had kept some. Okay, any questions about that or nothing? Okay.
Larry, actually, if I could ask at the risk of asking about drinking windows, which is obviously so imprecise, just in your estimation and even maybe for your palate, where do you think that Oregon Chardonnay is at its best? When do you what level of its or what point in its evolution do you find it the best, and how far do you think they can go with proper storage and obviously quality grapes?
Well, I know that our sisters will age nicely. I mean, that's the way we select it. It's going to age nicely for at least 3 years, 4 years. So if you have the patience and you really want to see what it can do, I'd wait at least that amount. But if you have it with the right food, you don't have to wait that long. It's really good. I mean, I drink it all the time, so you don't have to wait. But if you want to experiment and take a little bit of a risk, I think 3 to 4 years is very low risk and big gain for that. But frankly, all the wines we make age well. I can't make the same generalization for all Oregon Chardonnay or for this Oregon Chardonnay made in our style, because Dominique is so rigorous in how he makes all our wines with us, and Thomas is so rigorous and so devoted to making a wine that will age, that'll show what it can do in the long run, rather than something that's just flattering now. They're not looking for that. They don't want flattering now. They want to look for long term, and so they protect it. They don't add a lot of sulfur, but they keep it from oxygen. They put it in sealed tanks for 6 months prior to bottling with the lees, so the lees absorb all the oxygen that may be left in the wine from barrel aging. And when it goes to bottle right away, it's so tight, it needs to open up. If you buy a young bottle of our white wines and you want to drink it tonight, you better have thought about it last night, because you want to open it up, decant it, and let it sit for about 3-4 hours at the very least. I wind up decanting it 4 or 5 times before I drink it, because it just, what we do at bottling is we leave some CO2 in the wine, and from the fermentation, and when you bottle it, we don't try to get rid of it. You can measure CO2 levels, so it's bottled with a bit of CO2 from the fermentation, and with time that dissipates through the cork. But in the first 5 months, it's really tight, because it's like totally in an anaerobic condition for that much longer after bottling. And then it stays that way. It stays in an anaerobic situation very long. And so you can age it for a long, long time without fear of it turning brown or oxidizing or fading. We put an extra tight cork in it to prevent that from happening. Okay, is that it? Any other questions?
I think that's it for now.
Okay, let's go on to reds. She's checking the whites. That's one of our smaller white barrels. It's 600 liter. She's also fairly big, a tall woman, and she's very meticulous. She's the assistant winemaker, Kim Perry from Louisiana. And then this is my daughter. That's why I put that on. Now we're on our state. This is our first harvest of the state Pinot, and she's very happy about it. And there she is with the winemaker. And that's a Brooks t-shirt. They're neighbors as well. They're on the other side, south of us. I'm sorry, north of us. And it's a Riesling t-shirt. They make a lot of Riesling. So here we have Clotilde Lafarge on top of we have concrete tanks. We like concrete tanks. They make some of our best reds are fermented in concrete. Again, you don't need to pump it over. It breathes, kind of has a breathing action. You don't need to, you do some pump over because it's red wine. You have to wet the cap, but you don't really have to worry about oxygenation that much. And Clotilde's on top of the tank. Down here is a sommelier from Buenos Aires who came to work with us that year. And my assistant, Josh, who was at that time just a volunteer running a restaurant and fine dining establishment in the Cayman Islands. But he came to work with me here after volunteering for 3 years. He decided he'd just work for me instead of doing it for free. That's Clotilde at end of harvest, or in the middle of harvest, dumping grapes from the vibrating table into the sorting table with a rake. The rake's in the bin. And Josh cleaning one of the macro bins that the grapes are delivered in. And as I said, our labels show pictures of the universe, like not the sisters or the mimes, but the other labels have images of celestial maps. And we also have kind of a biodynamic philosophy along with the regenerative farming. We believe in ideas that are encompassed in biodynamic, even if we don't follow many of their practices, literally. And that's the moon sets and the sunset right over our vineyard. It's harder to get a sunset because it's just all white out, but the moon, it has an irregular schedule. So that was a moon set that was around 10 a.m. in the morning. So I got a lot of pictures where the vineyard is lit by the sun behind my back in the east, and the moon is in the west going down. That's our team. Dominique Lafone's son, who's a scientist mainly. He's and works with a venture capitalist company developing ideas and companies in Paris. And next to him is Clotilde Lafarge, who is the daughter of Freddie Lafarge, who's the son of Michel Lafarge, great winemaking family also in Volnay. And she did her last stage of her apprenticeship years with us. And down here is another apprentice from Germany, 7th generation Mosel winemaker's son. So we have an international team. This is the first harvest of estate fruit, 115 on block 9. So again, the 115 has the bigger clusters on the upper blocks. This is the shallow soil in the upper blocks, but this is the deepest part of the shallow soils. It's the Jory with a deeper soil profile. So I put 115 on it. And that's a view from the upper part of block 9, overlooking the valley. You can almost see 2 volcanoes you see in the top left, Mount Hood. And our new winery down there at the bottom, or at that time when this picture was taken, relatively new. So estate Pinot, this is what you're having. And I mentioned the celestial map. So if you look at this, you see this is a 15th century map which the explorers used to guide their journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the end of the world. And at that time, many people thought the world was flat, and that or at least the Earth, even if it is round, was the center of the universe. And superimposed on that in this other celestial map are images inspired by the Hubble spacecraft photos of the birth of the universe. That thing you can get as posters, the cradle of the universe. So these are constellations and galaxies being born at the fringes of the universe. And in this conception of celestial maps, the Earth is the utmost expression of God's creation. Man is the pinnacle of that and the master of that world. And we're going to go out and conquer all the unknown territories on this globe. And superimposed on that is the Hubble spacecraft idea of the universe, in which man is insignificant. The world is insignificant. We're all inhabiting a small little speck of dust afloat in the middle of a vast space. And the idea is that, we have the idea of we're exploring the soils of the Willamette Valley from a new perspective. But in the scheme of things, what we do, we have to take note of the whole universe, of everybody on Earth. So lingua franca means a universal language, one that can unite everybody together, regardless of your origin, into a common language, a common understanding. And I think that language in this case is wine. Well, I think of wine as a universal language, or a lingua franca, that can bring people together. And that's why we also have the farming philosophy we do, because we have to take care of this one little planet and help everybody on Earth to thrive and respect one another, so we can go forward, respect the Earth, respect one another, and improve what we leave behind rather than destroy it or exploit it. Anyway, that's the message of lingua franca in a way. And the state Pinot Noir is kind of a general representation of the vineyard as a whole, the complexity of the vineyard. So it's not just upper blocks, but it's like 80% upper blocks. But then upper block fruit is so mineral and so stony and so lacking in fruit. It has all the structure you'd want in a great red Burgundy, but I think it defeats the expectations of an average New World wine lover who wants to see fruit. So we take some of the best parts of the Pommard clone and the 667 clone from lower blocks in the heavier soils, the Jory and the Woodburn soils, to build the mid palate and the body of this wine. So this particular wine has a 777 clone from our Gelderman soils, which is a very nice balance. I think it's best balanced clone on its own. And then 943, which is mainly structural. It's really a firm, stony expression of flavor, more black tea, wet rock, almost a tar-like note that you'd find in Barolo. It's a very mineral, wild quality. And then you have that and a little bit of 119. It helps round it out a little bit. But then you put Pommard clone from the lower block, which has this big, juicy mid palate. So it helps round it out. So you have this combination of fruit, savory, black tea, smoke, tar, and floral, rose petal, even violet in this wine. So it's a really complex wine. And I think it's actually, our estate wines tend to be the longest to mature of all of them, because it's a composite of some of the stoniest, most mineral qualities of the upper blocks. And you combine that, even though you mitigate it with some of the fruity quality of the lower blocks, it's still expressive of that kind of power and weight that it needs, that it needs to be aged. Or on the contrary, if you have it with lamb, we've had it with lamb loin, we've had it with a lamb dish that was like a rack of lamb. I've had it with leg of lamb with the mustard sauce and herbs. It can stand up to that. I tend to like it best with duck, grilled duck, pan roasted duck, or quail, just because I like those things a lot anyway. And it's always fun to eat them, have an occasion to eat them. And then hard cheeses. I made up a whole list. I don't know if Silas is gonna. I didn't put in the lamb, which I should have for this, because it's really great with lamb. A chef had a dinner and he put that in. I was blown away at how good it went. Anyway, also wild yeast fermented, foot stomp. This one is probably, some parts of this probably stomped twice, and then maybe the Pommard clone a couple more times beyond that, but otherwise pretty gently handled. You have the 17 vintage, correct? Or the 18 now?
17.
17, yeah. So 18 was handled much more delicately than 17. 17 got a little bit more work in terms of the punch downs. And then again, very minimal handling, but we do have to acidify some of our Pinots slightly, because that's the one thing that really differs from Burgundy, is the pH for reds, not the whites, but the pH for reds. Because as in California, where you have mainly volcanic soils, as in Napa, it seems like red wines in volcanic soils tend to build up a pH that's a little bit too high at ripeness. Even if you have great acidity, like if you have a total acid that would normally put it into like a pH of 3.2 or 3.4, when it's totally ripe and you're picking it even at 13 degrees alcohol or 12.5 degrees alcohol, it tends to have a pH that's more like 3.5. And that's, we find that, and then when you ferment it, it goes lower because after fermentation, the pH kind of drops through the fermentation process. So it's, I mean, and the acid drops a little. So the pH goes higher. It goes to 3.6 sometimes, not quite, usually 3.5. We like to keep it at 3.5. So usually we try to adjust as minimally as possible with an acid addition, and it's usually 1/4 of a percentage point to 3/4 of a 3/10 of a percentage point, no more, because you can't really push a wine beyond what it is. If it has a slightly higher than 3.5 pH at bottling, that's the way it is. But for health reasons, for the wine to live a long time, it's better to have a pH under 3.5, just because that inhibits bacterial microbial activity in the wine later. So you don't have any unexpected re-fermentations later on. We've never had one, and I don't think we ever will, but just to be cautious. They're very cautious about that because they're so concerned about hurting the wine. But on the other hand, we're also very cautious about not manipulating the wine or changing it, altering it so dramatically that it's in effect destroyed anyway. So any questions about that? I think I covered all the points. Like again, 20% new oak, but here it's all barrique. So it's 80% old vessels up to 5 or 6 years of age. The first vintage we made had 10-year-old barrels, but right now we're at about 5 to 6. We find that's better for cleanliness. The longer you keep a barrel, the more chances you have of picking up some off flavor just from, let's say a lactic bacteria or something that may be part of the normal process, but it just has some wild lactic bacteria or something in it that you don't want expressing itself in the wines.
Larry, we do have a question from Lydia. What acid do you add to adjust the pH?
It's always tartaric. That's standard for winemaking. Many people, if they miss we try to get the pick dates properly, so we get the best flavor and the best retained acidity. But it's always tartaric, because tartaric is stable. Tartaric is Greek for grape, so it's the standard grape acid. But wines can develop other acids like succinic or butyric, or other, or ethyl acetate, acetic acid, and then that can devolve into ethyl acetate, from acetic acid. So those are all off flavors. Vinegar is acetic acid, so you don't want that. Although almost all wine has some. You want it minimal, and it actually is in a small amount. It's actually very aromatic, and it's called a volatile acidity. In the old days, we called it, the old English tasters called it, volatile acidity. It means vinegar, but a little amount of it actually is very pretty. It almost smells like raspberries. In a small amount in a good wine, it really lifts the flavor. But too much obviously is not desired.
Yeah, I think of old school Barolo instantly.
Yeah, or old Bordeaux had quite a bit too.
Yeah.
So it's not a bad taste necessarily on its own in a certain proportion. And then of course there's malic acid in fruit that hasn't gone through the malolactic conversion, and you definitely want your wines to finish mallow, because malic, when it converts to, that's how you lose some acid too, because malic is a very sharp acid and it converts to lactic, which lactic comes from milk. So kind of milk acid, you don't even think of milk as being acidic. And malic is green apple. Malos is Greek for apple. So think of green apples. So that's tart. So it goes from tart to round, because basically it's two molecules joined together to make, two malic molecules joined together to make a lactic. And our tongues taste, each of those separate molecules as another point of acid. So you're almost having the amount of malic acid when you go through malolactic. But that's only one portion of the acid, because tartaric at ripeness will probably be the dominant acid anyway in a grape must. That may be too much chemistry, but basically we do as little as we have to keep the natural acid and the natural flavors in the wine. And we don't have to do anything to the Chardonnay because of where we are and because of the way it ripens. But with red wines, it's a little bit slightly different. Any other points? Any questions about that, or any comments? Anybody? I don't know what it's tasting like, but it's been tasting pretty good lately. We've decided to age it a little bit longer this year and release it later. So I think it's tasting really good because we realize it just needs more time in bottle.
No, I see the interplay between the kind of mineral structure and the kind of lush fruit that you expect more from the Willamette Valley, but the structure is there. It's good.
Yeah. Well, this is our least structured vintage. This is our most opulent vintage in terms of fruit expression that we've had. So 18, again, there'll be a little more structure. All right. So this is how the vineyard looks in August. You know, a lot of, we don't, as I said, we try to do as little tilling as possible. People may wonder why no till. That was my desire, but we found out it really cut the vigor down so much we were losing a lot of crop, and it was not good. You keep the soil structure intact, and you increase the airflow between the topsoil and the atmosphere. So you increase oxygenation of the soil, and therefore you increase microbial activity, bacterial activity in the soil, and fungal activity, and that actually accelerates the rate at which the plant takes up its nutrients. Because as with us, we all know now that in our own bodies, there are more alien microbes in our intestines and in our bodies than we have of our own cells, our own DNA. And it's important for us, if we kill our microbiome in our intestines, we can't digest food properly. So when we go through antibiotic cures for some disease, we have to reestablish our own microbial population. And plants have the same kind of mitigation from microbes to take up their nutrients that humans do. Microbes play an important function in all life cycles. So no plant can just take minerals and nutrients right out of the soil unless they get fed artificially pre-digested things like fertilizers, artificial fertilizers. And we don't do any of that. We're also dry farmed. So no dry farmed, low till now. We have to till occasionally, we found out. This hadn't been tilled for like 7 years. And we decided we better start tilling again. You can't just go on forever without tilling. Again, the state upper blocks. And here we are in Mimi's Mine. So the last wine, we're a little over time already. So Mimi's Mine, this is a special wine. This is the only wine that we buy, the only grapes we buy to make wine. It's from Mimi Castillo's vineyard, her personal vineyard, she's a partner in Bethel Heights, but her own personal vineyard is only about, it's only about 1.5 miles south of us on the same hill at the same altitude. So it's 50-50, 50-6-6-7, and 50 Pommard. Her Pommard is very good too. It's similar to what we have because it comes from the same era, from the same pool of available grapes here. And they may have brought some up too from California, I'm not sure. Or they could have gotten it here. Maybe the Ponzi's even provided it for them. That's very similar to what we have. The 667 is a more modern clone. It came later. Pommard is a heritage clone that's been in the US for 70 years now, almost, or close to it. 667 came in the 90s, and it was an official government clone. It's very spicy, lower yield, beautiful expression. It's not the lowest yield clone there is, but it's a pretty low yield. But it has this really beautiful, spicy kind of flavor and a very nice tannin profile. So it's not too tannic. This is Mimi's vineyard, she used to have a flock of sheep. She doesn't any longer. The sheep were grazing. She didn't have to mow or till or anything. The sheep took care of it. It was beautifully, it looked like a golf course lawn, perfectly manicured everywhere, and material growing between the grapevines and between, and then the rows and everything. And this is Michael, the llama. Michael would herd the sheep and protect them from coyotes. Coyotes are afraid of llamas, and llamas will fight. So he protected her flock of dwarf sheep. The sheep were dwarf; they had to be dwarf so they wouldn't be able to reach the grapes. And the llama herded them. They were very, very good at herding the sheep. He treated it like as if it were his own flock. But unfortunately, it became too expensive for her to maintain, and her family didn't want her to farm that way on their own family vineyard, the Bethel Heights vineyard. So she wound up having to give up the sheep. And I wasn't prepared yet I wanted to buy them, but she didn't even tell me she sold them because she said, I'm not ready yet for them. And I think she was absolutely right. It takes a lot to manage a flock. And the flock lived with her. It was basically next door to her house that she kept them. This is what our vineyard looked like. You can see we had all our dandelions and flowers. She had some plants growing, wild plants growing there as well, and grasses. And this is after the sheep were lost, so it was a little rangy, because if the sheep were there, it would have been trimmed down to about an inch uniformly all the way through the vineyard. And her vineyard is about 7 years older than ours in terms of the planting, 6 or 7. So hopefully it'll only be, at that time, this is already 2 years or 3 years ago. So hopefully in another 3 or 4 years, we'll be there. And this is, again, looking towards the west, fog coming moonset. Any questions on that? Muse is probably the most celebrated wine we've had. It's also probably one of the longest lived wines. It has more whole cluster, so it has a little more tannin structure than some of our other reds in that sense. And it's just really an elegant wine that will age for a long time. It's most celebrated. Jancis Robinson, 18 points. Rob Report, one of the 14 top wines in the world of 2019, up there with Lafite and Dom Perignon P2 and a bunch of other wines. There was only one of 2 Chardonnays named. One was Ramey, their top wine, and ours, and the rest were like high-end Harlans and things like that. Dana, Harlan, Lafite, that kind of thing. So we were very pleased to be on that list, and they listed our very first vintage of Mimi's vine as one of the best wines in the world. And this year they listed our sister Chardonnay as one of the top. That's the top wine in Oregon, and as one of the top wines in the United States for Chardonnay.
Very impressive.
Larry, I think a lot of people might, having experienced Pinot Noir other than yours, found that the fruit generally in Pinot Noir seems to be sweeter and a little bit rounder. These I find are much more structured and somewhat tighter than many people might expect from Pinot Noir, with in fact striking amount of very good fine tannins. That is something that a lot of people, if they were to be given this in a tasting and be told that this was a Pinot Noir, they might be surprised.
Well, I think our wines, if you compare them in blind tastings to Burgundy, they are more similar. So our whites, and so a good example of that is when I released these wines to a sommelier in France. We're sold in France, by the way. We're sold in Taïwan. We're sold at Ducasse. We're sold at Sophie Peak. We're sold, we're in some 3-star restaurants there. We're at a Gavroche in London. We're at and I had dinner with a master sommelier who was French, working in London, and another master sommelier who was French but working in London. And the second one, it was the male who worked with me at Berry Brothers and Rudd, who represents us in the UK. And he said, he liked these wines very much, and we're tasting my releases, and we were introducing them to Marie. And Marie started tasting them and said, "Oh, they're pretty good. I like them. Oh, they're very French, very like Burgundy." And then she tasted a wine that's called Tongue in Cheek. It's a sister wine to the Plough. We have that. It'll be coming out again, another Tongue in Cheek, very soon. And she tasted that. And she said, "This reminds me of Pacalé." And I go, "Pacalé? Yeah, like his. It reminds me of his Chambertin kind of." And I go, "Really?" And she goes, "Yeah." I go, "Well, Pacalé is a cult producer. We hardly get any in Oregon, and frankly, it was hard to get in California. So I've never really tasted a Pacalé wine." And she turned to me and said, "I represent Pacalé in the UK, and I know they have some wine here. Let's try a bottle." So we opened a bottle. I said, I'm really curious because I really want to try it, because 6 months ago, I presented my wines to Gerard Marjon, who's been the head sommelier and buyer for Alain Ducasse for 27 years. And he has never said a complimentary thing about a New World Pinot Noir Chardonnay. But when he tasted my wines, he said he's in France after he had the second wine. He said, "I'm already in Burgundy." And then he named villages, and they were the villages that we had kind of referred to in our winemaking, kind of by joke. This is our Chambon Musigny. And he'd say, "Oh, that's Chambon Musigny." I go like, and this was like our Nuit Saint Georges. The wine you just had was more like our Nuit Saint Georges. He said, we didn't say anything. He said, that's like a Nuit, it's like a Nuit wine. That's from around Nuit Saint Georges. And then he got to the last wine, which I always had called our Chambertin, and he got to it was Mimi's Mind, and he goes, I can't say anymore. I don't know what to say. And he just, I won't say anything. It's just really good. And his assistant said, I think of Chambertin. And he goes, Le Chambertin, and he goes, yeah, this is in French. So yeah, like Pacale. So when she said Pacale, I go like, I got to try it. So we opened it up and we started tasting it. We go, oh, they're similar. Weight, color, structure, aroma. On the palate, there was a little more mineral quality. It was older. It was like 8 years older than ours, so it was more evolved. But it was beautiful. But the structure of the fruit, when you just start drinking it, we lost track. We were all looking at which glass was which after a while, which is the tongue-in-cheek and which is the Pacale. So there's a lot more similarities, but ours are definitely the best we can make in Oregon. So they're Oregon wines. If you can't really confuse them for Burgundy, the reds, but the whites you could, just because there's not very many wines like that made in the New World of structure and that you would expect to age. Most of the New World Pinots are made to drink, and they tell you to age them, but when you age them, you're inevitably disappointed. But so far, none of the wines we've made, none of the wines I made with Dominique or as part of with Dominique at Evening Land have faded, and I'm still drinking the 9s, the 8s, the 7s. As well as I stopped buying at the 12s on a regular basis, but I bought a lot, so I'm drinking them regularly, and they're better than ever. So I think if you treat the terroir not like a New World terroir, but treat it more like you would an Old World wine, and in the winemaking and the growing is so important. We grow them the way he would grow them in Burgundy. We treat them the way they would be treated in Burgundy. We pick them on the dates they would pick them in Burgundy, and by God, you wind up with wines that have a similar structure to Burgundy at that age of development. But you don't expect it because no one else does that. And that's why I wanted a team from Burgundy, not because I thought, oh, they know how to make wine. I thought they respect terroir and they'll know how to grow wine that it'll be the finest expression of true Oregon terroir. It might not take, and we had no expectations it would taste at all like Burgundy, but it would be what would be a similar equivalent. And the kind of the dangerous thing is that our Chardonnays have a lot more flavor common with white Burgundy in the sense of, because there's that structure and there's the contribution of the yeast, and the barrels are the same that they use, and that has a bigger impact on the finished wine than on the whites than it does on the red. The red, the place speaks through more loudly because it is what it is, and it's not, you need the skins and everything. You're getting a little more impact from the fruit itself, but even there you see so much diversity, even within my own vineyard, that it's just hard. We do make single block wines. Apart, the estate that you had was a blend of the upper blocks, but we make blends from specific individual blocks on the upper blocks, and they are all one different from the other, even though they're made identically, which is the beautiful thing about having a team that wants to reflect the values that you see in Burgundy here in Oregon, because then you arrive at something that's very distinctive and unique and fascinating, honestly. And we'll see how it evolves in the future. I think we're just at the beginning, but we've already had a good start.
Lovely wines.
Thank you. And I know it's late, so I hope does anybody have any questions? I'll be happy to honor them, but I will escape from my presentation if I can. Now I have to stop share. I'll stop share, and there we go.
We do have a question from Lydia. It said, we recently tasted Lingua Franca versus a couple of Dundee Hills Pinots. It was quite different. Is this typical for these two AVAs or unique to Lingua Franca?
What was the wine?
Just, I think, comparing it to Dundee Hills, kind of a classic.
Yeah. Well, in general, Dundee Hills fruit, so much depends on how people treat the fruit when they pick, how it's farmed, and the site itself. So there are sites in Dundee Hills that would be more closer to ours in terms of their soil structure, their exposure. But in most sites in Dundee Hills, they're either north on top of hills, or they're south facing, or either south, southeast, or southwest. But when they were planted, most of the vineyards, they were planted to have a southern exposure of some sort, because at the time they were planted, they're often more established, and they put them in jory soils, which are 4 to 8 feet deep. So they already inherently have more fruit quality built into the wine, and they're warmer than we are. Many, not every site, but most sites in Dundee Hills are warmer, have been chosen for more heat accumulation, because at the time they were planting, they thought Oregon was too cold. And then, and the soil depths are bigger. So in general, if we were making wine from Dundee, it would have a very different fruit expression than our wine that we make here from the Old Amity Hills fruit, or from the fruit that we select from sites that have this more easterly, shallow soiled profile. But there are similarities because it's all a volcanic series, and we do have jory soils in part of our vineyard, but it's colder here. So, then the practices of the grower, we farm, as I said, with minimal intervention in the vineyard, try to increase the microbiome. Some people there use sprays, or they're doing other things. So some people irrigate. I don't think there's not as much irrigation here as you'd find in California, because we just simply don't really need it in a good site with volcanic soil. In other sites, I think we'll see more, attempts to have more irrigation, because some other soils that are local don't have the water holding capacity of the basalt series volcanics. But if you told me what wine, I could tell you why there was differences. But every producer will probably have a slightly different take on what to do, when to pick, how to process it in the fermenting process, and how much new oak. There's so many variables. But as a whole, the Old Amity Hills has brighter fruit, better acid, and more mineral qualities, because it's shallower and colder than Dundee, which tends to have richer, more fruit-oriented wines. And they also tend to pick later there as a whole. We have a lot more people here looking towards this style that was already pioneered by Bethel Heights, but even more so by Christum.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with that in mind, I'm curious, what other Oregon producers do you appreciate on a regular basis?
Oh, I love Christum. I mean, obviously they're doing a lot of right things. I like what Bethel Heights has done, but it's not as consistent always. But they have great fruit sources as well, their own basically. But though some of theirs are facing west, I prefer the eastern side blocks. Then there's Evening Land, which I helped to create. So yeah, I think they've done some really great things. There's also Antica Terra has some really good wines. Sometimes I think there's some wines are a little idiosyncratic, but on the whole, they have interesting wines, and they're very successful. I think and I think actually I really enjoy what Domaine Drouin has done recently with the property here in the Old Amity Hills, which is more oriented towards what we're doing, a little brighter fruit, because that's what it is here. And then as opposed to the Dundee Hills fruit, which is the lower end and that kind of thing that they've established long ago. And that stuff is also killer with age. It needs more age because it's just so fruity when it's young, but as it evolves in the bottle, it also develops more mineral finesse and that kind of thing. And when her wines are 8 years old or so, 7, 8 years old, they're really magnificent, I think. But
That's
so there are a lot of good producers. Josh Bergstrom is amazing. I think even what Grand Moraine is doing from Kendall Jackson, that's been very positive. And so there are a lot of producers. Not everyone. I think Ponzi is a very different style, but they make some very good wines too. They make some outstanding wines, and I think they have some of the best vineyards. They take care of the vineyards very well.
Completely agree. The Alex has a question. What are Larry's thoughts on Rajpar's Pinot at Domaine de la Côte?
Well, I think he's done what he wanted to do, and he's I don't know what he's doing there now exactly, because he's starting 2 new projects. He's a natural winemaker now as well. So I'm not sure. He has Sandy, he has Domaine de la Côte, he has I'm not sure what the new project is called. Anyway, and then he had a couple of other things going on. So, but the Domaine de la Côte, the wines I had up until, let's say, 2014 or 15, I haven't had haven't had the more recent ones. I've been following what he does at Evening Land here at Seven Springs more closely, but they were good. They were very good, and they needed age too. They had a little bit too much whole cluster at first, and they backed off that a little bit. He was 100% whole cluster 100% of the time at first, and then he backed off and got a little more finesse into how he used whole cluster depending on the vintage. And I think the wines got better then. But I think all of those also really will age well. I helped develop that vineyard with Mark Tarlov when we founded. That was one of the other sites I said would be good to develop, but I didn't think he'd develop that site in addition to Oregon. I thought he'd take one or the other, and I was favoring Oregon, but he took Oregon, Sonoma, and Santa Barbara and the Santa Rita Hills. So that was too much. But it's a great site, and the part that I identified as the best is the La Côte part. Now we call it Tempest. That's what Mark Tarlov called it. I just thought it was the best part of the vineyard, from the location, the wind, and its proximity to the ocean, and how protected it was from the wind, being so close to the ocean, and the exposure. So it's turned out to be a very good wine. And then I like the movie Psalm 3. Our first vintage of Mimi's was in that as one of the best wines in the world, but Raj was the one chosen as the Burgundy by Jancis Robinson and a couple of other experts. Michael Broadbent, I think, was in there, and you're going like, oh no, it's Stephen Spurrier and Jancis. So I think that he got what he wanted, which is he felt he could make a wine that's like Burgundy in the New World. I still think that Oregon has a better chance of doing that in the long run, but he's done very well. I'm very proud of him. He was my protege, and he's done very well. And so I think all his projects are interesting, and I think Seven Springs here is great, and I think Domaine de la Côte has been great, and I wish I had been kept up to date more with that.
Larry, if I could ask a relatively open-ended question, that you kind of take it wherever you will, but just considering all the success that you and Dominique have had in the earliest stages with Lingua Franca, in such a relatively short period of time, if we have this conversation or we have this Zoom in 10 years from now, where do you think, what's the vision that you share, or where, personally, where do you think that Lingua Franca will be 10 years from now, and how will things change? And like I said, just kind of, leave it to you to, open-ended and take the question wherever you will.
Well, it's hard for me to say what he'll think 10 years from now or what I'll think 10 years from now, because, it's evolving. But I think what I thought at the beginning when I started this is one of the greatest sites in the New World to grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And I was very privileged to be able to buy a piece of land that's right next to my favorite place in Oregon, the one that I hold in the highest regard. And I knew it had as much potential as Seven Springs. So I just wanted to plant fruit here and maybe sell it and just be the one who developed it, because it was unlikely it would be developed by someone else at the time that I bought it. And so since I had the opportunity and I had the means just to buy it, not necessarily to develop it, I thought I would do that. And then Dominique said he thought I had something great and he wanted to be a part of that. So I said, well, I hadn't thought about making wine because it's a very cash intensive proposition and I'd have to raise money to do that. And then I inquired and I got people to invest. So there it is. Now it's a winery. And I think it's better than I thought, frankly. I think from the very beginning, it was a better project than I imagined even. It was like, how could this happen? We're making wine for I won't name the producer, it's not right for me to do that, but we're making wine for one of the top estates, one of the managers of one of the top estates in Burgundy. And you can think whatever you think, it's the highest that you can think of. And we're making wine for him under contract from fruit grown locally because he liked what we're doing. We have another investor who's running another prominent estate who makes only Chardonnay in Burgundy, I won't say what village, but he, in addition to Dominique, he's a major investor and believes in what we did very much too. So I just think that it was, when I started trying to get money to do this and someone said, you're going to have him, and you're going to be selling to Gerard Marjon, who always held any New World wine in contempt, or, I would have said that no way, that would be really the best outcome I could ever imagine. And we're lucky if we'll get like more than 90 points for the first 3 or 4 years for any of our wines. And so far, the lowest score we've ever gotten was 90 points for one of our wines, and everything else has been above 92. Most of it's been above 94. this year, even our less expensive wines have gotten 95s. I'm going like, impossible. That's not something, it's not the, a score isn't the be all and end all of everything, but it's like, how would you get that much recognition in so short a time if the wine wasn't really phenomenal? And so I'm very happy. And I think it's beyond what Dominique thought it would be as well. I think it's beyond what he didn't. In fact, the story of the Estate 16 Pinot was we weren't going to make it because Dominique said it could take 20 years before you have any fruit that's worth putting the estate name on. And then after the first vintage, he said in the blind tasting, we went through the blind tastings, and he says, well, you're already pretty good. You're better than most of what we buy from 25-year-old vineyards or more. And then by the end of the second vintage, which we wound up making the state wine, which is the 16, he said, okay, Larry, your wine's better than everything else already. So I think next year we just stop buying fruit. And I think we have an estate wine. He had been saying right up until that tasting, when we tasted right after the harvest, no estate wine for 10 years, probably, maybe 20. You have to see what you get. And then right away, he said, I think we have an estate wine. And I said, I think we have an estate wine. And the winemaker, Thomas, who also was skeptical, said, I think we have an estate wine. And then we talked about the wine that we thought we were making. We all took 3 different blocks. We all liked 3 different blocks better. We agreed that the other blocks that the people liked were our second best, but we liked a particular one better. And so we wound up making a blend. We argued about it for an hour. We tasted and retasted. And then I said, well, why don't we visit it again when it's had more development? And he said, we're going to do the same thing all over. That was Dominique saying. They said, why don't we just try a blend of all 3 and see if we like it? So that was our first estate wine, was a blend of those 3 blocks together based on each of our individual best wine of the vintage preference. So there you have it. It's full of surprises.
And more to come.
And more to come.
Well, Larry, with that, I think we're going to wrap things up. To answer one last question that was aimed for us, yes, all 4 of these wines are available for purchase. We'll send out a follow-up tomorrow, with the price and all the information about the wines. And Larry, I just want to extend another thank you to you for joining us. And I think your wines speak for themselves, but it's great to you walk through and hear your passion. It really is exciting.
Thank you. And if you want to know more, there's more pictures of the vineyard on our website, linguafranca.wine. So you can see everything. Cool. And you can get technical details on the particular blends that you tasted today.
Thank you, Larry. That was a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's so nice to see you again, Simon, and to do this tasting with you, Silas and Gerard. So thank you for setting it up.
Of course.
Thank you.
Have a pleasure. All right, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.